tell you just a couple things that we concluded as a committee about the housing issue. And then the experts are really going to touch on more of the detail about the issue. Our committee looked at data, we read reports, we looked at what other communities were doing, we attended some local meetings, and from that, these are really our main conclusions. First, it's probably clear to everyone that housing is a very complex issue. It's multifaceted, there's no single cause, there's no single solution. So this really was kind of a daunting task for us. The first thing we did was decide we were only going to focus on the local community. What could people in a local community do, not the state or national level? Housing affordability is a problem in Johnson County, and current efforts to address that problem are very limited. Another conclusion is that federal and state policy really are essential to creating a multifaceted, long-lasting solution. But there are things that local communities can do, and we think that this community should address some of those issues. Safe, stable, affordable housing is essential to civic life. Without a place to call home and a sense of community, people cannot participate in civic life, including local politics and voting, both issues that are very important to the League of Women Voters. So therefore, our committee concluded that this was an issue that we believe the League should take a position on, and we hope after the presentation and discussion today that you'll agree with that as well. So now let me introduce the panel to you, and they're going to offer more details. So next to me is Maury Thompson. He is Deputy County Manager for Johnson County Government, and in that role, one of his many tasks is to oversee the programs that the county manages around housing. Next to him is Valerie Carson. She is Planning Director at United Community Services of Johnson County, and one of the many things she does in that role is to facilitate the Johnson County continuum of care on homelessness. And next to her is Jennifer Krieger. Jennifer is the Financial Care Program Director at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. Jennifer, on a daily basis, interacts with people who are looking for help with their housing issue. So this morning, we're going to really do this as a conversation, and I'm going to pose some questions to the panel members. And we're going to start with looking at the data. So Valerie, will you tell us about the data about housing affordability and if that's a problem here in Johnson County?
Such a nice, simple question, Karen. Thank you.
And only a few minutes.
Okay. Well, let's first start with what we know the value of having a home is. Evidence-based research has clearly shown that households who have decent, stable, and accessible housing are better able to find and maintain employment, are better able to achieve economic mobility and move up, their children do better in school, and their household members are healthier. And all of those things in turn then promote our community's economic productivity and development. And so that seems like something that everybody should be able to get behind, right? This is kind of a win-win for the entire community. I think we would all agree that everyone benefits from having a home. And we know that different households have different needs. Now, in the past, and in the future. I know that my household's income has changed dramatically at different points in my life. And different people have different roles in our community. Some are teachers, others are business owners, law enforcement, the barista who maybe made your coffee this morning, clerks, administrators, and so on. Some are just starting their careers, and others are ending their professional ones and downsizing or retiring. So it makes sense that in order for all of the community's residents to have a home, that there needs to be a range of housing options at different price points to enable each of those households to themselves maintain stable housing while meeting their basic needs on a regular basis. So when we talk about housing affordability, we are not talking about a type of housing. We're not talking about who paid for it, where it is located, how it is configured, whether it's subsidized. We're talking about housing costs that are less than 30% of a household's income. Because what we know is that once a family or an individual starts paying more than 30% of their income on housing, especially if that household income is significantly below the median income for the area, that their risk for losing that housing increases dramatically. So for those who are cost burdened, those who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, they are more likely to be evicted if they are renters or lose their housing to foreclosure. They are financially fragile, and they are more likely to have to seek out social assistance programs in order to maintain their housing and meet their basic needs on a regular basis. Since housing's affordability is based on a household's income and not a prescribed cost amount or range, levels of affordability are specific to the incomes of those in one's community. So, is housing affordability in Johnson County a problem? Data on the number and the proportion of Johnson County residents who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, both renters and homeowners, would suggest that it is. 1 out of 4 Johnson County households is cost burdened, living in housing that is not stably affordable for them. Those who rent are 2.5 times more likely to be cost burdened than homeowners. 2 out of 5 renters, or almost 29,000 households in Johnson County in 2017, were cost burdened. And it's not as simple as, well, you need to look for a less expensive housing option. Fewer than 2,500 rental units in Johnson County had monthly rents under $500 a month, which is the amount affordable for a household in which someone is working full-time, year-round at $10 an hour. And conversely, it's not as simple as just making sure that a household has more than one income. The Johnson County community has long identified itself as one where single-family residents are welcomed and supported with families with children. But for many families with young children and only one income, housing that's affordable is outside of their reach. For that matter, more than 1 in 3 households in Johnson County are actually single households or single heads of households, which effectively limits them to one income. When 1 in 4 households is at risk for housing due to the proportion of their income going to housing costs, this can begin to erode their economic stability, impede their ability to make choices that might improve their future economic mobility, and restrain our youngest residents' achievement gains and health. Housing costs for all kinds of households in Johnson County have increased significantly between 2006 and 2016, but some more dramatically than others. While overall costs went up 14%, those who rented or had homes with no mortgages saw the greatest increases. Housing costs for renters increased almost 30% in that 10-year span, with homeowners with no mortgages, who are often seniors on a fixed income or limited income, increased by 18%. Cost increases for renters was 5 times that of homeowners with mortgages. The increase in the cost of living in Johnson County, driven in large part by rising housing costs, is outpacing local wage growth, leading to increasingly economically squeezed households. And being cost burdened is not just a mathematical calculation. Johnson County residents are feeling that squeeze. Based on local results from the annual Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System conducted by CDC and the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, 1 in 5 households report being worried or stressed about having enough income to pay for their mortgage or rent. and that proportion doubles to 2 in 5, or 40%, reporting worries and fears among those who earn less than $50,000 a year. The issue of housing affordability is increasingly not about having adequate housing options for them, but it's about having adequate housing options for us. Between 2007 and 2017, the number of homes that were valued at less than $250,000, those that are often starter homes for households just beginning their careers and families, and for those retiring and living on fixed incomes, declined by 20,000 units, while the number of homes valued at more than $250,000 increased by 30,000. These homes are not only outside the reach of young families and early career professionals and many single-income households, but they are also outside the reach of many of the professionals that make up the foundation of our community's well-being. Our first responders, our children's teachers, our local law enforcement. The social worker that assists us when we seek out safety net programs due to a sudden illness or a job loss in order for us to be able to meet our monthly costs. The home health aide who cares for our aging parents or for our spouse so that we can continue to work outside the home to make income so we can maintain our housing. All of these persons contribute to the health and well-being of our community, and there should be affordable housing options for them. And increasingly, there's not.
Thank you, Valerie. So, Jennifer, will you tell us a little bit about some of the real families that you work with?
Yes, we need to talk a little bit about family stories. Hold it up a little bit more. About family stories and people we're seeing. And it's kind of interesting. We're seeing two groups of people really consistently, like weekly. One is young families who are combining families to try to afford housing is the main issue, where the single mom with 2 kids will now be living with her sister and her mother, trying to get 3 adults paying in so that they can find someplace to live. An awful lot of that. What happens sometimes, though, is if one of those adults gets sick, now the whole family is at risk of losing their housing. And once they lose their housing, then they have an eviction, and then they can't find the next housing, even though they may have 3 incomes, and on paper they look great. On paper they look like, okay, we can handle that $1,200, $1,300 a month apartment because we've got all this income, but grandma got sick. They're managing because they're creative and because they're very motivated, but they don't have the wiggle room for anything to go wrong. And we all know something can go wrong. Someone gets sick. One of the kids gets sick. Someone gets laid off. Someone works for the federal government and doesn't work for 4 weeks. You know, very, very little things a car breaks down. Very, very little things. And these aren't people who don't save and try to have an emergency fund. One hit to your emergency fund and hit number 2 comes and they don't have it. So their grasp on their housing is unstable. They never feel sure. And I think and we see how much this affects them emotionally and psychologically. It's constant tension. We see an awful lot of totally stressed out households, from the parents to the children. We've done a lot of counseling with whole families, because everybody in the family is stressed, and economic issues are a big part of that. Other group that we see a lot are older singles. It's getting progressively difficult in Johnson County for retired people to stay retired and to find housing, or to live in the housing that they identified 5 or 10 years ago moved into, thought they were fine. There's been a lot of small apartment complexes purchased by bigger corporations. They come in and they make them really pretty. They do gorgeous stuff to them. And then the rent goes up $200 or $300. And if you're a widow living on a small pension in your Social Security, you don't have $200 or $300 more dollars for rent. That's going to mean not taking medicine or not buying gas for the car, not doing something. And so we see an awful lot of people who are, again, it's not just that they're worried about money, but they are so stressed that it's affecting all parts of their life. It's affecting their health, it's affecting their family relationships. And we've seen just a real upsurge in that, I would say like in the last 18 months, of those two groups not only being greater in number, but being very heavily affected in other areas of their life because the housing issue is terrible. And they're always, give me a list of affordable apartments, and my list is getting really tiny of places I can send them. And if they have an eviction, it's even tinier. It's very, very difficult, and these are real people. And Valerie pointed out, these are teachers. These are the people that hand you your dry cleaning. These are young people just getting out of college who thought this job they got was just the best, but they can't find any place where they thought they wanted to live. So that's kind of who we're seeing. And I think just the affordability issue and the consistency issue of being able to write out what should be a small bump are the two things that are really holding them back.
Jennifer, you mentioned the eviction. Would you just explain to the audience what that means if someone has an eviction or a bad credit report and how that affects them being able to find housing?
In Johnson County, and especially as the corporate entities have bought up a lot of the properties, a lot of the apartment complexes, credit becomes really important. And a lot of young people don't have great credit ratings. They have a very heavy debt ratio because of student debt. Other people, someone got sick and they got 2 months behind on their rent and they got evicted. An eviction in some of the systems where you go to apply, and you pay $25, $35, $50 to apply for an apartment, and it's not refundable. But some of these apartments, one eviction and they will never even proceed with your application that you just paid for. And there's no time or setup to explain where that eviction came from. Yes, I had an eviction 5 years ago. My husband left me and the children. And look where I am now. I've got a job, I have income, we can afford this apartment. There's no means to have that conversation. People get turned down again and again and again because years ago they missed a couple of rent payments. And I am well aware that the landlord's got to pay bills too. But we're talking about past histories that really have an impact and make the offices and the landlords feel uncomfortable about renting to this person. And there's not really a way right now in place for someone to stand behind them and say, and I think Valerie or somebody's going to talk about some ways that might work, but they need someone to stand behind them and say, it's okay. And if they don't have parents or relatives who will pay the extra deposit or put their name on the lease, they can have a really hard time. An awful lot of people that we see people weekly who are staying in their car, and who are staying in their car with children. And one of the reasons they're doing it is because they're holding on to the money for an apartment, but they can't find one that will take them. Because some setbacks have made them look like bad tenants, even though they're probably the most motivated tenants you're going to see, because they really want a roof over their heads and their children's heads. The same with older people, they may have lower credit ratings, a lot of times because they just don't have much credit at all, they don't use it. bills, they do their business, they don't have a lot of credit, and that lowers their credit rating, and then they get passed over. They can get passed over in their own apartment complex where they've lived forever because they're writing all new leases and they're running all new credit checks. So these are kind of some of the setbacks on some of the things that are keeping good people in Johnson County from just settling in, going to work every day, raising their children, and moving along.
Thank you. So, Valerie, what about low wages? We've talked a little bit about the cost of housing and people who work here and maybe can't afford to. So how do wages play into this?
Well, obviously, wages determine your income, and so then income is inherently enables you to stably maintain your housing. If you look at the wages of jobs in Johnson County, what you have, in the second quarter of 2018, about 28% of jobs in Johnson County, or about 3 in 10, had hourly wages of less than $15 an hour. And this translates to a maximum if you actually made $15 an hour. And so I'm saying 28% or 3 in 10 make less than $15 an hour, just to be clear. But if you were at $15 an hour, this translates to a maximum of about $31,000 a year in income if those jobs were year-round and if they were full-time. So that means that you would need to find housing. So that's the cost of rent. In order for that to be affordable, when we talked about affordability and cost burden being no more than 30%, you would need to be able to find housing in Johnson County that both the rent and the utilities and any fuel for heat would together have to be less than $770 a month. And those places just don't exist in Johnson County. Not when those units are just, they keep shrinking, I think, as Jennifer said. Many of the places that have been considered affordable housing complexes in prior years, as she alluded to, have been purchased from larger corporations that are outside and are not based in the community. They've been made to look lovely, but they're now all of a sudden unaffordable for the people who are currently living there, and then they can't renew their lease, and then there's this increasing pressure on an ever-shrinking number of affordable units. So even if you can find housing that you can afford, you may not qualify. Many of the landlords are requiring things, not only not having had an eviction in the last 5 or 6 years, and that's one of the things that's interesting to look at, is that when I started doing this work about 10 or 11 years ago, it used to be 2 or 3 years. If you'd had an eviction that was 2 or 3 years ago, then they would look at you again and give you an opportunity. But now it's 5 or 6 or 7 years before they'll even consider giving you an opportunity to be able to rent. But many landlords are now requiring that your annual gross salary, meaning before your taxes are taken out, are at least 40 times your monthly rent. 40 times. So that your annual gross salary must be at least 40 times your monthly rent. Or that you have to bring home 4 times the rent and income monthly to even qualify in order to be able to get into those apartments. Thus, for a median rent apartment in Johnson County in 2017, which was $1,044 a month, you'd need to bring home almost $4,200 a month before taxes. So wages make a big difference.
Would you repeat? Did you really say 40 times?
For your annual salary. Yes.
Annual salary.
Yes. That landlords will require that your annual gross salary be at least 40 times your monthly rent. So if you have $1,000 rent, that you need to make at least $40,000 a year before you can qualify.
So we've talked about low wages and seniors and single earning households. And there are some other populations that are also vulnerable about housing, that it maybe isn't even income related, but it's connected. So do you want to mention any of those at this point that we could touch on, and then we'll move on and hear from Maury about county programs.
Well, to make it much more complicated. So obviously income is a big piece, but we all know, and maybe it's in our family, maybe it's among our friends, that there are a lot of other challenges that potentially can dislodge people from stable housing. So some of that vulnerability may be that someone becomes disabled, and their source of income while they work their whole life is suddenly dramatically shifted. There are those who have their problems, not only physical problems, but for mental health problems can be an issue. There are those who experience domestic violence. And I think, as Jennifer pointed out, there may be a situation then with domestic violence or a sudden divorce that suddenly puts a household, their income drops, or they have to flee, and then that becomes an issue for their credit. Other vulnerable populations are those who are born with intellectual and developmental disabilities who, when their parents have passed and they are now adults and living and they are likely working, but may not be able to make a wage that will be able to support them here, but they need stable housing. So I think there are a lot of... thank you. And then there are those that have touched our criminal justice system. And then when they come out and they have been accountable for what's happened, and they've spent their time, and they come out, and many of them, if not most of them, have families. They can't find anybody who's willing to take a chance on them, even if they are employed.
So county government does have some programs that work with populations that Valerie just mentioned, as well as there are other nonprofits in the community. Those programs are somewhat limited, but we're going to hear from Maury Thompson now, who will talk about the county's role in housing.
Thank you, Karen, and good morning, everyone. Pleased to be here. So let me start by picking up where Valerie just finished. When you talk about housing affordability, I characterize it in a couple of different ways. And one is those housing affordability issues that affect the general population. As Valerie was saying, they're only compounded then if you have additional needs. And when I look at that population and the support that county government provides, I look at our Human Services Department, which provides support to those with physical disabilities and our senior population. Our Mental Health Department, who of course provides support to those with mental health needs. Corrections, as we just heard from, and those who have been formerly incarcerated, and the additional burden that puts on them, and again, trying to locate safe and affordable housing. And lastly, we are more frequently seeing this group that we call super utilizers of many of our services of county government, crossing across those. Someone with significant mental health concerns that also then becomes a frequent utilizer of our emergency medical services system, making calls for first response that really aren't related to the need for emergency response, but is a social service need. So we're working to try to address those concerns. And then finally, before I move on a little more specifically to what the county's doing, I want to go back and reinforce what we just heard from Jennifer and Valerie, and that's the turnover that we're seeing in our rental market here in Johnson County and the impact that's having on the populations that we as county government work for. I'm growing increasingly alarmed at the reports I hear from staff on a regular basis about someone who is fortunate enough to have a housing choice voucher or Section 8 program, but literally cannot find someone who will accept that. And I'm being told it's because of, again, just what we heard. These complexes in our community that have long accepted that voucher, who are now being sold to, many times, to out of county owners who are coming in and doing some renovations, and rents are going up significantly. And I'm also hearing, just as you heard, that the deposits that are being asked for, the clients that we support just do not have the resources to do that. And then maybe even most alarmingly is the trend I'm hearing about the non-refundable application. It's just a loss of money when probably clearly we know up front they're not going to meet the requirements, but we're accepting that money for the deposits, which is, again, extremely concerning. So then, to the role that county government has, in terms of the general population, and again, in housing affordability, I'd suggest that our role is somewhat limited. Most of the issues around affordable housing are really the purview of the cities in the county. County government has purview, if you will, over the unincorporated areas of the county, so again, not a lot of significant housing work being done in that area. What else did you want me to comment on?
Can you talk about the role that cities play in terms of, the zoning?
Sure.
All the different
And
cities.
yeah, so maybe that's a good point to share some information that we have been having as part of county government this conversation over the last few years, recognizing the need around affordable housing. The Board of County Commissioners about 2 years ago, in their priorities that they laid out for staff and direction, identified those that are housing insecure as a significant issue. I know we have two new county commissioners here with us today. Spent a couple of days with them and their peers this past week, looking at what are their priorities for the coming 12 to 18 months. And again, housing affordability, pleased to say, rose to the top of that priority list. So I believe the elected Board of County Commissioners and the staff are dedicated to working on this. That's the good news. The bad news is, again, our ability to influence, I think, is somewhat limited. Back to the good news, though. Part of our role that we see in county government is to really serve as a convener or facilitator of community conversations that impact all of us. And in that role, we have begun conversations with our city partners about what we can do collectively on this issue. And I'm pleased to report that the response is very positive. I don't think there's lots of disagreement in the community that we really do have an issue. There may ultimately be some disagreement about what those solutions are and how we want to address it, but the recognition of the issue, I think, is shared. So we're starting to have conversations with our city partners about the need to do a comprehensive analysis study of the housing issues in Johnson County and a good response to that. So we will continue to pursue that. Also looking at, we'll hear a little bit more about, are there policy changes that can be effectuated that will help this situation? I think, again, our city partners are open to that as well.
Would you speak specifically about what cities do with zoning and they could create a set aside, that they have a lot of policy, what those some of those specifically are?
Yeah, when you start to talk about then what is the role of the city, you can start to look at planning and zoning issues, regulations around rental properties. I think we'll hear later on there's been some movement in Topeka that hasn't been positive in terms of allowing cities some flexibility to do that. Our planning department is planning to take a much more active role in that conversation, and again, helping to facilitate those conversations with our city partners. So I think there are some tools, there are some opportunities. However, there, as we've acknowledged, there are a lot of constraints. A lot of this is just due to the robust housing market. And again, I would suggest in and of itself, that's a positive thing, that values are increasing. It's just, unfortunately, there are some downsides to that as well.
Well, while you still have the mic, I'm going to ask all the speakers to kind of address that point. Why isn't more being done about affordable housing? What are some of the barriers?
Okay, well, part of it is a little bit of human nature. If you're a household who hasn't experienced difficulty maintaining your housing, then you don't think that is something that's a problem. And I would say you don't think that until it is, or until it is for your children, or for your parents, right? And so it isn't until that personally touches you that you go, oh, now I see I think of a board member at UCS whose daughter finished school, and she and her child were looking everywhere, and she had a good job, but she could find nothing in Johnson County to be able to live here. And this is a young family that is contributing already to Johnson County and wants to be here and can't. And I think there's also preconceptions about who struggles with housing needs and issues around that that potentially aren't aligned with reality. Given that if 2 out of 5 of us are worried about being able to pay our mortgages or pay our rent, then that's not them. That's us. That we're worried about making those. But I also do appreciate the fact that, as you alluded to earlier, it's a really complex issue. And when you start talking about, so what could we do, I think often people also kind of start going, okay, so if that's done, what does that mean to me? And what kind of loss could I experience? As opposed to, how would this improve things for the entire community, and thus, in a lot of ways, make our entire community healthier.
So I would add to that, again, market forces in this area are very powerful. Again, some really good things here. People want to be in Johnson County, so we're seeing housing prices increase. The housing market is very robust. Again, in and of itself, positive things. Part of the conversations that we've started as county government has been not only with our city partners, but some conversations with developers. And it's an interesting conversation when you start talking to them about the market forces there and where their profit margins are. They will tell you in many cases, we can make much more money building the higher priced homes than we can the lower priced homes. So for the same amount of effort, relatively speaking, to make more money, that's where we go. So again, I've talked to some of them, and they're sympathetic to them, but again, the market forces where you can make more money doing this versus this, guess where it goes. So until we can figure that out, which is tied in part in Johnson County to land cost, which are driving up the price of construction as well to build that unit.
And I think the one other piece that goes with that is it's not only that it's more profitable, but that there's limited number of people that can do this work. And the fact that people are reporting to us from construction that they can't even find enough employees to be able to do the work.
Great point. And I also hear, Valerie, that when you talk to developers too, there is still some hangover from the Great Recession. They will talk about the loss of builders that we experienced that frankly just never came back. And part of that may be you can't find the workers, so it's a really difficult thing. Karen was just asking me to speak to the public subsidy thing. We've had those conversations with developers too, and quite frankly, my opinion is, unless we're willing and able to provide significant subsidies, it's still not enough. And again, that's a tough conversation to have when you're talking about real significant subsidies to builders.
Does anyone want to speak to, go ahead, Jennifer, if you have a comment.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the, and it is, I hear all the time, the skilled trades to build the houses, to build the apartments aren't there, and that the developers have trouble finding crews. However, they are going to continue to have trouble finding crews if the crews can't afford to live here. And I think making the point that our workforce is important, and the level of living that Johnson Countyans enjoy and expect, both in ease and in quality of everything from houses to stores to parking places, is great. I think we're going to start seeing a real lowering of that because the people who do the work can't live here. And on snowy days can't show up for work because they live 20 miles away. And I think we're getting robbed of diversity overall. And in the end, I think that makes us a weaker community. That we want to make sure that only people who, make, what's your figure, where in my head, but $40,000 a year and up, at least can even think about affording to live here. But we're only going to pay them $9 an hour. It's self-destructive.
So to that point, Valerie and I happened to be in a meeting yesterday, and there was a major Johnson County employer in the meeting who made a very striking comment to me. His business is at the point where they need to expand, but because of this workforce issue, not having workers who are able to live in Johnson County, which leads to their availability for work and other related issues, he was now considering expanding outside of Johnson County because of this workforce issue, which is tied to housing again. So I think if we're not careful, the day is coming where that's going to be a significant influence, and it's going to start influencing the cost of our goods and services in Johnson County because the workers aren't here to provide those services.
I think one other point to make is that it's also just a philosophical question. Is housing a right? Some people believe that it is, and on the other side, others don't. That it's, and so that fact that there is no common agreement about that very basic question makes this a difficult issue to address.
And I think, Johnson County has been really, really good in each of its municipalities on doing spend a lot of time, effort, and investment in economic development, in bringing companies here, and trying to increase the number of jobs that are available, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're creating and bringing a business in that has 10,000 jobs, I think you have to have a parallel discussion at the same time that says, so where do those 10,000 people live? And if those jobs range from paying $32,000 a year to $100,000 a year, do we have adequate housing to be able to, for that full range of those different things? Because people will prefer always to be able to take care of themselves, to be able to meet their needs on a regular basis. They don't want to go to Jennifer. Not that Jennifer isn't lovely. To be able to say, please, can you help me? Because that's kind of mortifying. They would rather be able to take care of it themselves. And they work hard. You work just as hard making $12 an hour, 40 hours a week, then, if you're making $30, you're just as tired. And you want to be able to, after you worked hard, be able to meet the needs of your household.
Add to that real quick, I do think there's a glimmer of good news on that issue. I believe there is a growing realization on the part of the general public and policymakers that the old adage that a job is a job is a job is not true. It's got to be a job that provides a sustainable living wage for you to be able to support yourselves to live in the community that you're in. So I think there is, again, a growing willingness to examine that and making sure that the jobs that oftentimes we're helping incent are actually jobs that bring value to the community.
And I'll just mention one other thing that makes this a more complex issue here in Johnson County is, as Maria said, the cities really have a lot of responsibility for many of the housing issues, the zoning and fees that are charged and all of those things. And because we have 20 cities, they're all different. And so while a business may start in one city, those workers aren't all going to live in that particular city. And there is no coordination or master plan for all of the cities. So conversations among the cities with the county is really an important step in looking at how do we have more of a comprehensive plan. So that moves us to talking about what could be done about this problem. So I've asked each of the speakers to think about what can be done on a local or state level to address this problem. So I don't know who'd like to go first. It's a complex issue nobody wants to address.
Well, we can kind of riff off what you just said, and some things that Maury said earlier. One thing that needs to happen is we really need to understand this issue, and those who are going to dig into what is happening around housing need to be representatives across all 20 of our local municipalities, because I think that all of the cities need to feel invested in addressing this particular issue and understanding where is housing now and where is housing going. And so if the last time we did a countywide housing study was back in 2004, I believe. It's a long time ago. And there's a lot more people, and there's probably, maybe there's even, and that would be the thing to understand, maybe even our levels of income are even more heterogeneous now. But we need something that's up to date. We need to make sure it's something that all of those different municipalities are invested in. And then once that study has been put together, and with that study there should be possible things that need to be put into place in order to assure that we have a more robust and varied housing stock, then there needs to also be some type of task force that again represents all of those municipalities, but has to represent developers and landlords and realtors, because we need people that are boots on the ground and understand what the market forces are and understand what the challenges are, and who are willing to say, yes, I'll step up to the table and I'll try to figure out, as opposed to tell you all the reasons why this can't work, that I'm willing to say, let's figure out a way to make this work and what we could do differently and who do we need at the table to be able to do that. Because we need those people who this is their livelihood to be the ones that are informing that implementation and then continuing to be able to check on whether or not we're accomplishing what we hope, and that as new gaps may emerge, that we can be responsive to that.
Okay, so we've heard repeatedly that this is a very complex issue, and it is. It's hard to have a conversation about affordable housing without talking about wages and without talking about transportation. It's another key to that. So Karen just slid me a copy of the best practices in the REIT study, and there's two that jump out to me, and one is around transportation. I think we need to do a better job of looking at that holistically when we talk about housing, making sure that transportation is a component of that. So looking at where we locate housing and how we address the transportation needs. One of the keys, in my opinion, of that is thinking about transit services differently in this county and looking at more specialized micro-transit options. This is a community that's fairly diverse in terms of geography, and those transportation and housing don't always match up. We know that we've struggled in Johnson County with the traditional transit model, so I believe we need to begin to look at that a little differently, and in fact, I will share with you that we're doing that. So I think that could be a big piece of this. And then there was the housing choice voucher. I talked about that a minute ago. Continued advocacy with the federal government around housing, vouchers for housing. Right now in right now in Johnson County, we have two housing authorities. One is administered by the county, and then the city of Olathe has their own. So I'm just going to refer to some county statistics right now. Housing choice vouchers, again, the old Section 8 program, is a subsidy for low-income individuals to help them meet their housing needs. It is a subsidy that they can apply then in the private market to someone who's willing to take that subsidy to help them afford their rent. Unfortunately, the demand far outpaces the supply. Right now in Johnson County, again, not considering the city of Olathe, but the rest of the county, we have about 1,500 vouchers, household vouchers, to assist with rent. Unfortunately, our waiting list, looking at my number, is now a little over 950 people waiting for a voucher, which is approximately a 2 to 3 year wait. So obviously, the need is far outstripping the availability of those vouchers.
One of the things that And you know, I come from the touchy-feely side, so I'm not as good with the numbers. But one of the things we've been having a lot of conversation about is having conversations. If you are an employer, do you know where your employees live? Do you know how they live? If you're an employee, do you know how your employer lives? I mean, do you know how hard was it for them to get here today? If they're missing work, do you really know why they're missing work? Is it because they have a sick kid and no one to care for them? Is it because they're living in their car? And if you own properties, you know, who are the people who are living in your properties and what kind of struggles are they having? What might help you help them? Because it costs money for people to move out, and it costs a lot of money to evict someone. Just conversations and getting to know people that we just kind of walk past every day and we don't know what their living is like. We don't pay a lot of attention to that because we're busy and they're busy and they may not want to share, but if this county's kind of a funny little capsule and we need to get to know each other better. I think there would be a lot more movement toward worrying about affordable housing, worrying about transportation, worrying about things that we just get to know each other. So there's your touchy-feely moment.
I'll just share a couple of the other things that the study committee looked at in terms of best practices. There are lots of other communities that are using things like tax incentives for developers. They are looking at some of the rules and regulations about zoning and allowing smaller size lots, increased density. A number of things like that are being used to make, in order that builders can build housing that is more affordable. First-time home buyer programs, requirements that new developments have affordable units. One of the things that our committee particularly liked was the notion of a local housing trust fund. Valerie referenced a study that was done back in 2004, and as a result of that community planning project, that was a recommendation which was never implemented here. But we believe it has a lot of merit. And you see many communities across the country adopting a housing trust fund, which is a fund that is created using dollars that have either come from a mortgage tax registration fee or some other kind of small tax that is applied on a housing-related process. And then those dollars are made available to help developers as grants for other kinds of housing opportunities. So that's one thing that we think would be important to take a look at. Anything else to offer in terms of best practices or things you'd like to suggest as a idea? Okay. Let me remind you that you have cards if you have a question, and fill that out, and if my committee members will look for people holding them up. I see them kind of scattered all over, and if you kind of start collecting those. And while we're collecting cards, I'm going to ask the panel to each, in just a few words, talk about, from their perspective, why this is such an important issue. Just kind of summarize your thoughts about why this is an important issue.
Well, I'll start by suggesting that if we don't address this issue, it's going to have a dramatic impact on us as a community. We're going to force our friends and neighbors out of the community because they cannot afford to live in Johnson County. And I would suggest that's not the community that we want to build, where it's a community that just some can afford to live here. It's not a community that we want where, again, as you've heard, people providing services to us can't afford to be our neighbors, and they have to live someplace else and then struggle with transportation to get into Johnson County to provide those services.
The question is, why is this important? I think it goes back to what I said at the very beginning. I don't think anyone would disagree that housing is critical to our well-being and our health, and that everyone needs housing. And so if Johnson County is known as being a very innovative, cutting-edge county, we want to be on the front end of being able to address issues. We know that this is an issue across the country. Johnson County also has its own self-image, is that we are a welcoming place and a healthy place for families with children to be able to grow up in. We want young professionals to come here and to get engaged in civic life and to contribute to this community so that we can grow into something even better that maybe we haven't even conceptualized yet. And we want to make sure that as people age and they leave their professional lives, that they can continue to be engaged in this county and give back to it and weave their knowledge and their experiences back into this community and into the next generation. And if we don't assure that range of different people at different points in their life doing different things have safe and stable housing, then we lose. We lose as a community, and we have to become something very different. And I think that we instead want to really work towards what we see as this community's strength.
Really, I think Valerie just did it. But I think it's important because these people are our neighbors. And we want these people to be our neighbors. We don't want for the county to be a restricted place where only one kind of person can live and only one kind of person can afford to live. Because frankly, that just doesn't, it's not a structure that's sustainable. Sustainable communities are full of all different kinds of people. They're full of all different kinds of jobs, all different kinds of living situations. But healthy, sustainable communities, all of the living situations are at least healthy and doable, and no one's living in their car. And I keep getting back to that, but I am telling you, I see a number of people every week who are living in their car and trying to work in Johnson County. That's not who we are. I've lived here all my life, and I really don't think that's what the people in Johnson County are.
Thank you. Well, clearly this is an issue that has lots of interest. We have a large stack of questions up here, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But the first question we're going to deal with is about the state legislature, and the question is, has the state legislature done anything to help or hinder this issue? And we know that in at least 2 instances, there are some laws that are a hindrance to being able to address this. And Laura, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Sure. So my understanding is that back in 2016, the legislature passed legislation that prohibits local governments from enacting zoning laws that mandate some affordable units. So I started by saying I think we all agree on the problem. Maybe we don't all.
Don't all agree.
But seriously, this may be an area where we can agree, but we don't agree on what the solutions are and how best to address this. Again, my understanding, for what it's worth, this was a provision that passed that was an add-on to an existing piece of legislation, so probably wasn't well vetted and well debated. So I would suggest maybe that was a problem in and of itself. Here in Johnson County, one of our principles, and in county government specifically, is local control. So I would suggest that this is an issue that takes local control, of course, away from us and being able to come up with the best solutions for our community. So for that reason alone, I think that we would have some issue with this.
This is somewhat related. A question asking, can cities and counties pass an ordinance that requires apartment managers to disclose disqualifying conditions before accepting applications and non-refundable fees? we'll say we don't know. So here's a question asking how Johnson County housing affordability compares to Wyandotte or Jackson County. And second, does HUD have housing development funds available to cities and county? Valerie, do you want to at least speak to the HUD part? Well, I think you speak to the CDBG and to the homeless funds.
But they were asking for housing development.
No, just, well, have housing development funds, but.
There's community development block grant dollars that come into the county from HUD, which have been about $1 million a year. And as you can imagine, $1 million a year doesn't buy much in Johnson County when it comes to housing development. But most of those dollars are specifically used to support areas that where mostly low income or median to low income persons live, and being able to improve those areas, so they don't really get woven into the creation of additional housing. And there is for those who experience extreme housing issues, such that they become literally homeless and are living in their cars or in other places not meant for human habitation. We bring in between $600,000 and $700,000 a year to try to provide assistance to get people back into private housing. But again, much like the housing choice vouchers, there are many. It's very difficult for to engage landlords and say, will you give these persons who, if you've become homeless, what do you usually have? Eviction issues, you usually have credit issues, you likely have some complicating issues, and so it's really hard to get people to even take the money to give those persons a chance again.
Yeah, I would agree that the federal dollars coming into the community really aren't going to development, primarily again for the housing subsidies for people to pay rents, and then for home rehabilitation. So you can make the case, funds are going in to help people maintain their level of housing, but again, not a lot that I'm aware of in terms of new development.
And this is about subsidized rentals for seniors who only have Social Security. So there are some specific properties that are senior only that are based on income. Can someone speak to that, or kind of qualifications for that?
I'm not an expert, but there are several apartment facilities here in Johnson County, some in Olathe, some in Overland Park, that are basically your rent is 30% of your income, whatever your income is, and they just have income adjusting for certain things. I know one resident who had a hospital visit, a large hospital bill, and they actually lowered her income for the time where she was paying off that hospital bill. So there are some, but there aren't enough, and they tell you the waiting list is 2 years. Now, it doesn't always take. I always tell people, put your name on it anyway, because it doesn't always take that long. If you're willing to take the studio apartment that becomes available first, and the 20 people ahead of you went and found something else, or moved in with their family, or passed away, or whatever, it can be shorter, but it can still be long. And there is something really soul-crushing when you think you found the solution to having someone tell you it's a 2-year waiting list. The county's aging, the income level is kind of stagnant for a lot of people. I think if there's a way for these places to be profitable, they could build 10 more and fill them up. And they are pleasant places to live for these people. There's community, there are some services. These aren't nursing care or even assisted living. These are independent living, but with some services and just with a community that cares about what you're doing and watches TV with you, has bingo. They're good choices, but there aren't nearly enough apartments. And as the community ages, we're going to need more of them.
And I want to point out, it's not just about the number, it's about whether you can get access to them. And so I think, Jennifer, you explained that situation for those seniors, which are often for 55 and above. But also that Maury spoke to with the housing choice vouchers, and I think you said the waiting was about 2 years? 2 to 3 years. What isn't in that piece of information is that it's a closed system. You can't get onto that list at any time during the year, depending on what's happened to your housing situation. And so what generally happens, because I get to push it out to everyone that I have on a million email lists, is that will come open once every 18 months, 24 months. And they will start taking calls at 8:30 in the morning, and they will take up to, till I get about 1,000 different people. So it's open one day. And then it's closed again for a year and a half to 2 years. So that's a whole lot of other days where people are going to go through a housing crisis that they can't even get access to get on the list, even if they qualify.
We have a couple questions about different kinds of models about subdividing single-family homes or shared equity home ownership, and those would be issues that cities would have control over in terms of their responsibilities for zoning and making rules about housing. So I'm not sure anyone has.
Yeah, just to really quickly say that I'm familiar with both of those models, and there's a housing organization in Douglas County, I think, that's further along in looking at those as potential options than we are. So we've begun conversations with them about that. One thing that I didn't mention earlier, that I said the county's role is pretty limited in terms of addressing this housing issue. But one change that we made a few years ago was to allow for what we call ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. Again, in the unincorporated area, it's allowing for smaller structures to be constructed next to a larger, for an aging parent, for a child with a disability. So one minor step in helping address that situation.
A couple people asked about the NIMBY issue, not in my backyard, and how do communities combat that when the neighbors are opposed to housing that may be of a lower cost than what their housing is. Anyone have any strategies or ideas about that?
No. But to further bring you down on that topic, just a growing concern about that issue as well. As we all know, what's happened to the housing market here in Johnson County over the last few years, the number of apartment complexes have increased significantly, and really luxury apartments. I know we have one city who fairly recently was going through the zoning process for what I'd call a high-end luxury community, and the neighbors turned out to say no to that. So it wasn't an issue of really even affordable housing. It was, we believe we've got enough multifamily housing. We don't even want that at this point. So again, kind of a new wrinkle on that issue of not in my backyard. Now, even if it's luxury in some cases, I don't want that in my backyard. The question was, do we know what our vacancy rates are? Yeah.
They're all full, all
Yeah.
of these that are being built are.
Yeah, I was going to say I can't quote it, but yeah, I agree, it's low.
What was the answer to that?
What did you think what it was? It was the vacancy rate on multifamily. It's low. I'm not sure what the exact percentage is right
Just
now.
multifamily, I don't know. Okay, I just wondered if it was.
I do think that there have been other communities that have, when they very purposely have been doing development, that they have, that regardless of that, if because there are communities where they say, if you're going to do a development of 100 houses, 15 of those have to be more affordable, and they make them look just exactly like everybody else's houses. And so you don't see a difference. There's just some differences in the way that they're constructed that make them less costly, and so they're able to be offered at a low rate.
But our legislation prohibits you can do it.
But But when we start talking about tools or barriers to being able, for us to be able to be innovative, in addition to what Maury shared about some of the policies that have been put in place, our legislature at the state level has put into place legislature that says that as a community that we can't do that. We can't say to developers that a certain portion of what you're developing be affordable.
So a couple questions deal with regional issues. So, you know, we are a metropolitan community. One note card raised the issue that housing in the Northeast is more affordable, and are we trying to just push everyone who can't afford high-priced housing into one particular part of the county? And another raised the question that if Kansas City public schools get their certification, that might raise property values in Kansas City, and people may be more willing to live there than some have been. And is that going to kind of help with the housing, affordable housing issue if people now have kind of broader choices? Does anyone have a comment about how this issue is a regional issue and how there might be more regional solutions to it?
Well, again, Valerie and I were in a conversation in a meeting yesterday where this issue came up about what should be our strategy at looking at housing as a just Johnson County issue or a regional issue. And again, there were great arguments on either side of that question, and I think most of you know that the City of Kansas City, Missouri has been having some very focused conversations around policies and strategies on affordable housing as well. So we know it is a regional issue. Where my perspective yesterday on when asked this question was, I do continue to believe that there are some unique challenges in Johnson County. So back to that conversation, my advice was we probably need to look at that right now, again, in my opinion, as a Johnson County issue. Not that we should close ourselves off to the conversations on the regional area and find those commonalities, areas we can work together. But again, we've got some unique challenges here in Johnson County. Okay. So the question is, when an apartment complex is renovated, doesn't the county issue building permits or other required procedures? Why can't the county require a percent of rents not get raised? And again, this would be a city issue. And to the last part of the question about those restrictions, I don't think that those would be allowed under current state laws that we just talked about.
Questions ask, what examples exist around the country where a holistic approach has changed the housing dynamics? I will tell you that as a committee, we looked at a number of communities. Some have adopted comprehensive housing policy or plan. You may have been reading in the newspaper that Kansas City, Missouri is looking at a whole set of new housing policies, trying to have a comprehensive approach to that. I don't think that, at least we didn't come across any long-term research that showed that there had been plans put in place that really had a significant impact on this. But right now there are communities trying to look at a more holistic approach. Collier County, Florida is one that comes to mind. Another, I think, is Knoxville, Tennessee. There's a community in the state of Washington that we looked at their study. So places around the country are starting to take a look. Does anyone have other examples that you've looked at or thought about to share?
Give millions of dollars for affordable housing in
Well,
Silicon Valley. Is it Google?
It's Amazon.
Okay.
And they had done housing there, and they also have money that they are planning to invest in New York when they open their new office there. But I don't know about you. I've read mixed on both sides about the impact of that. So I think, you know, the jury's still out on how well that kind of plan's going to work.
I have 3 more, right?
Okay. We have time for just maybe a couple more.
So the question is, I understand the county has a housing and community development committee. What are their goals to address affordable housing issues? And to be quite honest, I don't know that the housing and community development committee has goals around affordable housing. They have other tasks that they're looking at, not that they couldn't be a part of the larger conversation, but I will share that county government as a whole, part of the effort that we're undertaking is we have recently created and are now recruiting for, if anyone's interested, a housing navigator position whose role will be to work with hopefully not only the populations that we currently serve, but maybe a resource to the larger community to help address some of these particular issues. And again, we're starting out as one person, so the impact of being able to individually address issues around affordable housing is going to be very limited, but a step in the right direction, hopefully, for us.
And this will be our last question. The question asks, what's being done around young adults who are aging out of the foster care system? And Valerie's been working on that issue, and I'll ask her to speak to that.
Well, specifically, for those who are aging out of the foster care system, there's even more complexity because it is not just about trying to establish their own housing, but often if you are in foster care, that means at some point you are removed from your own home, which probably means that you've had experiences of trauma, etc. In addition to the fact that while you were in foster care, you likely were in multiple homes, which may have its own risks for different experiences and have not had a lot of experience with stability. If you've aged out, that means you were never adopted, and you never had that family, so your social network is potentially very limited, and who you may know are other people that are just like you. And so UCS has been working on the transitional age youth, as we call them, group, and those that have been at risk because they're coming out of the foster care system. They're at very high risk for multiple negative types of adult outcomes, such as homelessness for the young women, early pregnancies, being unemployed for extensive amounts of time, not being able to take advantage of education. And so we really are, the housing response is one component of our response to that, because they not only need housing, but they need access to health care, mental health care services, and they need connections to employment, and they need connections to education, and they need to potentially take advantage of those social systems and supports that they can maintain from the state for a certain amount of time after they age out of foster care. But you have to be able to convince them that they still want to be part of that system when most of them feel like the system is the enemy in many ways, and they just need to go take care of themselves. So we are actively working on potential options, and we have opened a transitional living program for 18 to 21-year-olds, some of who have aged out of foster care and experienced homelessness here in Johnson County in the last year.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel for being here this morning.